I'd like to offer you $1 million as a token of my gratitude for saving my son's life, announced Maxwell Thornton, America's fifth-richest tech entrepreneur, as he stood uncomfortably in Ray Donovan's weathered kitchen, surrounded by bodyguards and assistants who eyed the humble farmhouse with poorly concealed disdain. The third-generation farmer's calloused hands gripped his coffee mug tightly as Thornton's team already surveyed his struggling property, discussing how the land could be transformed into a private lakeside retreat. But 3 days later, when county officials and journalists gathered at the ancient oak tree by the lake, Thornton's confident smile vanished as Amy Chen from the Historical Society stepped forward. Our research confirms that this 80-acre property contains the last intact underground station on the Freedom Trail, with documented records of over 300 people finding safe passage here, making it immediately eligible for National Historic Landmark status and exempt from all private development proposals. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Silver Creek Valley had once been known for its fertile soil and close-knit farming community. The Donovan farm, with its centuries-old oak trees and modest white farmhouse, had stood as a community anchor for over 150 years. Its boundaries, marked by the same stone walls built by Ray's great-great-grandfather, Ray Donovan, 58, was the fifth generation to work this land. His great-great-grandfather Thomas had established the farm in 1867, building the sturdy farmhouse and barn using timber harvested from the property itself. Family stories told how Thomas had insisted on the farm's unusual layout, with the house positioned far from the road and the barn situated to block view of the small lake from passing travelers. In recent years, as corporate farms expanded and wealthy urbanites discovered the area's pristine lake and rolling hills, many family farms had surrendered to economic pressures. Land once valued solely for crops suddenly became prized for luxury vacation properties that promised wealth beyond what farming could provide. Every evening, Ray would walk down to Silver Lake, a small but pristine body of water that formed the southern boundary of his property. The lake wasn't much, just 10 acres of clear water fed by natural springs, but it had been his sanctuary since childhood. In recent years, luxury homes had sprung up on the opposite shore, their large windows and boat docks a stark contrast to the untouched natural shoreline of the Donovan property. It was on a sweltering July afternoon that fate intervened in Ray's quiet life. He had been repairing fencing near the lake when he heard desperate shouting from the water. A teenage boy in an expensive kayak had capsized and was struggling in the deep water at the center of the lake, clearly panicking and unable to swim. Without hesitation, Ray dove into the water. Though no longer young, years of physical farm labor had kept him strong. He reached the thrashing teenager, speaking calmly as he supported him and slowly brought him to shore. The boy was terrified but unharmed, coughing up water as Ray helped him onto the grassy bank. "Thank you," the teenager gasped when he could finally speak. "I thought I was going to die out there." "Lake's deceptive," Ray replied, wringing water from his shirt. "Looks calm but has strong currents from the springs below." The boy introduced himself as Ethan, explaining he was staying at one of the vacation homes across the lake. He'd taken the kayak out without telling anyone and had panicked when it tipped over. Ray gave the boy a spare t-shirt and walked him back to his property line, pointing out the shortest route around the lake to the vacation homes. The following morning, Ray was startled by the sound of helicopter rotors. He stepped onto his porch to see a sleek black helicopter descending onto his east field, the downdraft flattening his young corn stalks. As the helicopter powered down, 3 men in suits emerged, followed by a tall man in his 50s, wearing clothes that appeared casual but that Ray could tell cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Donovan?" the man called, striding purposefully toward the farmhouse. "Maxwell Thornton, I believe you met my son Ethan yesterday. I understand you pulled him from the lake." Ray recognized the name immediately. Maxwell Thornton was the founder of Thornton Technologies, a tech giant worth billions. His face regularly appeared in business magazines and news programs. "He was having trouble in deep water," Ray said simply. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone would have," Thornton replied, his expression serious. "Ethan can't swim well. He admits he panicked and was going under when you reached him. Our family doctor says he likely would have drowned without your intervention." Ray shrugged, uncomfortably at the praise. "Just glad I was nearby. May we speak inside?" Thornton asked, gesturing to the farmhouse. Ray led Thornton into his kitchen while the security team remained outside. The billionaire seemed oddly out of place at Ray's worn oak table, like an exotic bird that had landed in a chicken coop. "I won't waste your time, Mr. Donovan," Thornton began. "You saved my son's life, and I'm here to show my gratitude. I'd like to offer you $1 million as a token of my appreciation." Ray nearly dropped his coffee mug. The amount was more money than he would earn in 20 years of farming. "That's not necessary," he managed to say. Thornton smiled with practiced charm. "I insist. In fact, I've had my team look into your situation. I understand the bank is foreclosing on your mortgage next month. This would clear that debt with substantial money left over." Ray stiffened. "You looked into my finances?" "I like to be thorough," Thornton replied unapologetically. "In fact, I have another proposition. My family fell in love with this lake, and I've already purchased 3 properties on the far shore. I'd like to buy your land as well, at well above market value. You could retire comfortably, and I could create a legacy property for my family." Ray noticed Thornton's team outside the window, already walking his property line, taking photos and making notes. One was standing by the lake, gesturing toward the shoreline, as if envisioning future development. "This farm has been in my family for 5 generations, Ray said firmly. "It's not for sale." Thornton leaned forward, his expression calculating. "I understand sentiment, Mr. Donovan, but be practical. Small farms like yours are becoming economically unviable. The bank will take this property in 30 days regardless. I'm offering you a dignified exit and financial security. Those other offers weren't coming from someone who just put a helicopter in your cornfield," Thornton added with a slight edge to his voice. "I could make things very difficult for you with the bank. Alternatively, I could ensure your remaining time here is comfortable. I know the regional bank president personally." "I'll need time to think," Ray said carefully. Thornton nodded, sliding a business card across the table. "Of course, I'll have my team draft a formal offer for both the reward and the potential property purchase." He placed a check on the table for $50,000. "My helicopter has damaged your crops. Consider this compensation while you consider my offer. I'll return in 3 days for your answer." After Thornton departed, Ray remained at his kitchen table, staring at the check and business card. The money would solve his immediate problems, but accepting it felt like the first step towards surrendering his land. What Ray couldn't know was that Thornton's visit hadn't been merely about gratitude. The tech mogul had already met with luxury resort developers to discuss creating an exclusive getaway centered around Silver Lake. The Donovan farm, with its extensive lake frontage, was crucial to the plan. Thornton had already quietly purchased surrounding parcels, positioning himself to control all access to the lake, with Ray's farm being the final piece. What neither of them realized was that the ancient oak tree by the lake shore concealed historical significance that would dramatically alter their confrontation, evidence hidden for over 150 years that no one had recognized in generations. The morning after Thornton's visit, Ray woke before dawn, as farmers have done for generations. Instead of immediately tending to his morning chores, he found himself drawn to the ancient oak tree by the lake. Standing beneath its sprawling branches as early light filtered through the leaves, he studied the tree with new eyes, not just as a familiar landmark he'd known his entire life, but as something that might soon be cut down to make way for some billionaire's boathouse. The oak had always been special to the Donovan family. His father had often told him how each generation was instructed to protect it, though no one quite remembered why anymore. It was just tradition, one of many passed down without explanation. Now, with Thornton's pressure hanging over him, these details seemed like clues to something he had never fully understood. Dad always said great-great-grandpa Thomas was particular about this tree, Ray murmured to himself, running a hand along the rough bark. Said it was more important than the house itself. As Ray inspected the massive trunk, which must have been at least 5 feet in diameter, he noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. Near the base, almost hidden by exposed roots, was a small carving, weathered by time, but still visible. A simple arrow pointing downward with what looked like a 5-pointed star above it. Ray frowned at the marking. It looked intentional, not like natural scarring on the bark. He had walked past this tree thousands of times in his life, but had never noticed this detail before. Perhaps it had been exposed by recent erosion from spring rains. Later that morning, Ray called the one person who might shed light on his situation. Dr. Ellie Washington had been a history professor at the county college and local historical society president for nearly 15 years. At 62, she had dedicated her career to documenting the often overlooked history of the region, with particular focus on the Underground Railroad routes that had once run through the area. "$1 million offers, eh?" Ellie said when Ray explained the situation. "And I'm guessing it's not just gratitude for saving his son. That lake of yours has become prime real estate." "He's offering enough to clear my debts," Ray admitted. "But once I sell, the farm will be gone forever. 5 generations. Ended with me?" "The timing is suspicious," Ellie noted. "Have you looked into whether your property might have any historical significance that could prevent development?" "Wouldn't know where to start," Ray replied. "But I did notice something strange at the old oak tree this morning. Some kind of marking I've never seen before." Ellie was silent for a moment. "The oak by the lake. That's interesting. Your great-great-grandfather, Thomas Donovan, appears in some of our research. He arrived in the county in 1867, right after the Civil War. There are gaps in his history before that, though." "Could you come take a look at the marking?" Ray asked. "I'll be there in an hour," Ellie replied, her voice tinged with excitement. When Ellie arrived, Ray led her to the oak tree. Despite her age, she moved with the energy of someone half her years, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses as she studied the carving Ray had found. "Well, well," she murmured, kneeling carefully to examine it more closely. "This is certainly interesting." "What is it?" Ray asked. "It looks like a navigation marker," Ellie explained. "Similar symbols were used by conductors on the Underground Railroad to guide escaped slaves to freedom. The arrow indicates direction, and the star was often used to mark safe houses." Ray frowned. "Underground Railroad. Here. Your farm is in what would have been a strategic location," Ellie said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "Near water, isolated enough for privacy, but close to routes heading north. The timing fits too. Your ancestor established this farm right after the Civil War." She gazed thoughtfully at the tree. "Did your family keep any records from Thomas Donovan? Letters, journals, that sort of thing?" "There's an old trunk in the attic," Ray replied. "My grandmother used to say it contained family papers. But I've never gone through it. Never seemed important." Together, they climbed to the farmhouse attic, where generations of family items were stored in old trunks and wooden crates. It took nearly an hour of searching through dust and cobwebs before they found a small leather trunk with T. Donovan stamped on its lid. Inside were bundles of yellowed letters, land deeds, and at the bottom, a small leather-bound journal. The spine was cracked with age, the pages brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. It was dated 1865-1870. Ray carried the journal downstairs where they could examine it in better light. Most entries focused on practical matters: crop, planting, building the farmhouse, weather patterns. But as they carefully turned the pages, scattered entries caught their attention. Met with Jay again regarding the route. His assessment of the lake crossing seems sound. With proper precautions, it should remain secure indefinitely. The false wall in the root cellar is complete. Additional expense considerable, but there can be no compromise on this aspect of safety. The markers are in place. Only those who know what to seek will find them. Ray looked up from the journal. False wall? The farmhouse doesn't have a root cellar. Are you sure? Ellie asked, her expression intensifying. Many old farmhouses had root cellars that were later sealed off or forgotten. Ray thought for a moment. There's a strange section in the basement. One wall doesn't seem to match the foundation dimensions. I always assumed it was just irregular construction. They made their way to the basement, a space Ray rarely visited, except to check the furnace. One section of the stone foundation appeared newer than the rest, with different mortar work. Ray had never given it much thought. Old houses had repairs and modifications over the years. Ellie examined the wall carefully, running her fingers along the mortar lines. This section was added later but made to look original. See how the stone pattern doesn't quite match? She pressed against different sections of the wall, testing for movement. Your journal mentioned markers. I wonder if there's a mechanism similar to what we found in other safe houses. For half an hour, they searched for any sign of a hidden mechanism. Finally, Ray noticed something about the pattern of stones. 5 of them formed a rough star shape, similar to the marking on the tree. What about these? He asked, pointing to the pattern. Ellie studied them, then pressed each stone in sequence, starting from the top point of the star. After the 5th press, they heard a faint scraping sound, and a section of the wall, about 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, shifted inward slightly. It's a door, Ray whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. Together they carefully pulled the disguised door open, revealing a narrow passage into darkness. Ray retrieved a flashlight from upstairs, and they cautiously entered the hidden space. The secret room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a low ceiling and no windows. But what it contained made them both stop in astonishment. The walls were lined with small niches that once clearly held candles or lamps. Simple wooden benches ran along 2 walls. In one corner stood what appeared to be an old water pump. Most significantly, on the far wall was a large map, painted directly onto the plaster, showing the surrounding counties with coded symbols marking routes and locations. This is an Underground Railroad safe room, Ellie breathed, sweeping her flashlight across the pristine space. One of the most intact I've ever seen. This would have sheltered people escaping slavery on their journey north. She carefully examined the map. These symbols correspond to known safe houses, including several that have been documented. But this location, your farm, isn't in any of our records. It must have been kept secret even from other conductors. Ray approached a small wooden chest in the corner, secured with what appeared to be an original iron lock. With Ellie's guidance, he carefully opened it to find a leather-bound ledger and what looked like a collection of small personal items: a carved wooden bird, a child's cloth doll, a tarnished silver locket. The ledger, written in a neat hand different from the journal upstairs, contained dates and numbers spanning from 1867 to 1872. April 15th, 1867, 3 souls delivered safely. Continued north with J, June 2nd, 1867, family of 5 arrived via southern route, remained 3 days due to patrols. December 10th, 1867, 2 souls, 1 injured. Provided medical care before proceeding. The entries continued for pages, with over 300 people accounted for over the 5-year period. These are names, Ellie said softly, pointing to small notations beside some entries. Initials mostly, but some full names. This is extraordinarily rare. Most conductors avoided writing down names for safety reasons. She examined the personal items with reverence. These appear to be tokens left behind by those who passed through, perhaps as thanks or to mark their journey. Ray sat on one of the wooden benches, trying to process what they'd discovered hidden within the walls of his family home. A historical treasure his great-great-grandfather had deliberately concealed and protected. Thomas wasn't just a farmer, Ray said quietly. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Ellie nodded, her expression solemn. And not just any conductor. Based on these numbers, this was a major junction point. The lake would have provided a natural barrier against pursuit, and the isolated location would have been ideal for hiding larger groups. She turned to him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Ray, do you understand what we've found? This is one of the most significant Underground Railroad discoveries in decades. This room, with its original features intact, and this documentation would almost certainly qualify your property for the National Register of Historic Places, which would mean your property would be protected from development," Ellie explained. Historic designation would prevent any significant alterations to the property, particularly ones that would damage or obscure its historical significance. So Thornton couldn't build his luxury retreat? Not here. He couldn't, Ellie confirmed. Once registered, this property would be preserved specifically because of its historical significance. As they carefully examined more of the hidden room, Ray felt a connection to his great-great-grandfather he'd never experienced before. The man had built this farm not just as an agricultural operation, but as a sanctuary for people seeking freedom, a purpose far nobler than Ray had ever imagined. "I never understood why my family was so adamant about keeping this place," Ray said. "Each generation just said it was important to hold on to the land. Now I know why." Ellie was photographing the map on the wall. "We need to document everything properly, and then contact the State Historical Preservation Office immediately. This discovery changes everything, Ray." As they carefully secured the hidden door before leaving, ensuring the contents remained protected, until proper preservation experts could be consulted, Ray felt a profound connection to his ancestors and a new understanding of the legacy he had been entrusted to protect. A legacy far more significant than he had ever imagined. What neither of them realized was that their discovery would soon place them in direct conflict with one of the most powerful men in the country. A man unaccustomed to having his plans thwarted, especially by a humble farmer and a small-town historian. "We need to approach this carefully," Ellie advised as they gathered at Ray's kitchen table that evening. "What we've found isn't just historically interesting, it's a potential legal shield against Thornton's development plans. That ledger and the intact safe room could invalidate any attempt to repurpose this land." Ray studied the photographs Ellie had taken of the hidden room. "How quickly can we get official protection?" "I've already called Marcus Williams at the State Historical Preservation Office," Ellie replied. "He's driving up tomorrow morning. Given the exceptional nature of the discovery, he thinks we can fast-track the application for the National Register." "Will that be quick enough? Thornton said he'd be back in 3 days for my answer about selling." Ellie tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "The preliminary protection can be put in place almost immediately once Marcus verifies the authenticity of the site. The formal registration process takes longer, but even beginning that process creates legal obstacles to development." "I still can't believe my family kept this secret for so many generations," Ray said, shaking his head. Not a word about it in any family stories, just instructions to protect the land and the oak tree. That was intentional, Ellie explained. Even after the Civil War, there were risks in being identified as having helped escaped slaves. Your great-great-grandfather was protecting both the people he helped and his family by maintaining absolute secrecy. Ray's phone rang. Thornton's name appeared on the screen. He answered cautiously, putting it on speaker so Ellie could hear. "Mr. Donovan," Thornton's smooth voice filled the kitchen. "I hope you've had time to consider my offer." "I'm still thinking it over," Ray replied neutrally. "I understand. However, I thought you should know that my team has conducted a thorough assessment of your property this afternoon. Their report suggests structural issues with your farmhouse foundation that could complicate any future sale or refinancing." Ray and Ellie exchanged alarmed glances. No one had been authorized to inspect the farmhouse. "Your team was on my property without permission?" Ray asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The county assessor's office conducted the evaluation." "At my request," Thornton replied smoothly. "As a potential buyer, I'm entitled to request public records regarding properties of interest. I'm merely sharing information that might impact your decision." The implication was clear. Thornton was using his influence to create additional pressure. "I appreciate your concern," Ray said carefully, "but I'll need the full 3 days as agreed." "Of course," Thornton replied, "though I should mention that my plan for the lake development has generated considerable interest from the county commissioners. The projected tax revenue is quite substantial. They've scheduled a special meeting tomorrow to discuss expedited zoning changes for the entire lakefront area." After Thornton ended the call, Ellie's expression was grim. He's accelerating his timeline and leveraging his connections. The county commissioners can't override historical preservation designations, but they could certainly complicate the process. "Can they really condemn my house based on some fabricated report?" Ray asked. "Not legally, but they could tie you up in expensive inspections and red tape," Ellie explained. "It's a tactic developers often use against holdout property owners. Create so many bureaucratic obstacles that selling becomes the path of least resistance." The following morning, Ray was checking the farmhouse foundation, which was perfectly sound despite Thornton's claims, when he noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked on the county road near his property. Through binoculars, he could see people with surveying equipment on the adjacent public land, marking boundaries and taking measurements of the lake access points. What Ray didn't know was that at that very moment, Maxwell Thornton was meeting with county officials. The billionaire had brought architectural renderings showing a luxury resort complex that would transform the sleepy rural area into a high-end destination. The Silver Lake Resort will generate approximately $12 million in annual tax revenue, Thornton explained to the assembled commissioners, plus create over 200 permanent jobs. The economic impact for this county would be transformative. "And all the necessary properties have been secured?" Commissioner Jenkins asked. Thornton smiled confidently. "All but one final parcel, which is currently in negotiations. I anticipate having complete control of the lakefront within days." What Thornton didn't share was that his development team had already scheduled construction equipment to be delivered to a staging area near Ray's farm by the end of the week, creating a point-of-no-return pressure tactic that had worked effectively in previous negotiations. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams from the State Historical Preservation Office arrived at the Donovan farm. 47, he combined formal training in architectural history with practical experience in preservation law. His government-issued SUV kicked up dust as it rolled up Ray's driveway, where Ellie was already waiting. "Dr. Washington," he greeted her warmly, "when you called about an intact underground railroad station, I thought you might be exaggerating. You know how often these claims don't pan out." "Wait until you see it, Marcus," Ellie replied. "It's the most perfectly preserved safe room I've encountered in 30 years of research." Ray led them to the basement and demonstrated the hidden mechanism that revealed the concealed door. As the preservation officer stepped into the secret room, his professional demeanor visibly shifted. "Good Lord," he whispered, sweeping his flashlight across the intact space. "This is extraordinary." For the next 2 hours, Marcus examined the room's features, meticulously documenting everything with specialized equipment. He studied the ledger repeatedly, occasionally murmuring to himself as he cross-referenced entries with known underground railroad routes. "The construction techniques match the period exactly," he explained, examining the hidden door mechanism. "And these coded map symbols correlate with documented safe houses from other sources. There's no question about authenticity." He carefully examined the personal items from the wooden chest. "These artifacts represent an invaluable historical record. Most underground railroad stations were dismantled after use or modified beyond recognition over time. Finding one this intact, with documentation and personal effects, is unprecedented in this region." "Can this help stop Thornton's development plans?" Ray asked. Marcus nodded emphatically. "This isn't merely significant, Mr. Donovan. It's a landmark. Discovery for American history. This site would easily qualify for both the National Register of Historic Places and likely for National Historic Landmark status, which provides the highest level of protection." "How quickly can you take action?" Ellie asked. "I'm implementing emergency protective measures today," Marcus replied, already completing forms on his tablet. "This grants immediate preliminary protection while we fast-track the formal registration process." "How long would the preliminary protection last?" Ray asked. "Initially, 60 days. That would give us time to complete the documentation and secure permanent protection," Marcus explained. "Given what I've seen, I have no doubt about the outcome of the application." As they carefully locked the hidden room, Marcus's phone rang. His expression darkened as he listened to the caller. "It seems word of a historical discovery at the Donovan farm has already reached the county offices," he said after ending the call. "The county administrator contacted our office asking for information and expressing concerns about unverified historical claims interfering with economic development." Ray and Ellie exchanged concerned looks. Their window of secrecy was closing, faster than anticipated. "Thornton must have informants throughout the local government," Ellie surmised. "If he learns exactly what we've found before the protection is officially registered, he might try to challenge the designation or accelerate his development plans," Marcus finished. "I've seen it before with developers who tried to create facts on the ground before preservation orders could be finalized." Marcus departed to file the emergency protection measures, promising to expedite the process as much as possible. As his SUV disappeared down the gravel drive, Ray noticed the surveying crew had moved closer to his property line, now openly taking measurements along his access road. That evening, Thornton himself arrived unannounced at Ray's door. The billionaire's casual attire couldn't disguise the tension in his posture. "Mr. Donovan," he began without preamble, "I understand you've had the Historical Society poking around your property. Finding anything interesting?" The direct question confirmed their suspicions. Thornton had informants monitoring the farm and was well aware something significant had been discovered. "Just researching my family history," Ray replied neutrally. "My great-great-grandfather was one of the first settlers in this area after the Civil War. Historical features rarely affect development rights significantly," Thornton said dismissively. "At most, they might require some minor documentation before proceeding. Our timelines account for such minor delays." "I haven't agreed to your offer," Ray reminded him. Thornton's eyes hardened. "I've been more than generous, Mr. Donovan. $1 million for saving my son, plus well above market value for this property, but my patience has limits." He studied Ray's face carefully. "I've learned that your property taxes were reassessed this morning. Quite a substantial increase, I hear, almost as if someone pointed out overlooked improvements to the county assessor. Ray felt a chill. The implied threat was clear. Thornton was using his influence to increase financial pressure through multiple channels. I still have 2 days to consider your offer, Ray replied, working to keep his voice steady. Indeed you do, Thornton agreed, with a thin smile, though I should mention that my construction team begins staging equipment tomorrow. Once that process begins, my investment threshold changes. The offer on the table won't remain available indefinitely. As Thornton departed, his normally confident demeanor showed subtle signs of concern. The billionaire had clearly expected Ray to capitulate under the intensified pressure, and his continued resistance, coupled with historical preservation interest, suggested something had fundamentally changed in the equation. What Thornton couldn't know was that Marcus Williams had already submitted the emergency protection forms with preliminary photographs of the hidden room, photographs that had caused immediate excitement among federal officials responsible for historical preservation. The race was now on Thornton accelerating his development timeline, while Ray and his allies worked to secure protection for the historical treasure hidden within the walls of the Donovan farmhouse. Less than 48 hours remained before Thornton's deadline expired, but the next day would likely determine whether a century-old legacy of freedom would be honored or if corporate interests would prevail. As dusk settled over the farm, Ray stood alone by the ancient oak tree, placing his hand on the rough bark his ancestor had carved with guidance symbols for those seeking freedom. Tomorrow would bring either the first step toward permanent protection of this sacred heritage or the beginning of a more difficult battle against a billionaire with seemingly unlimited resources and influence. What Ray didn't yet know was that Ellie had made one more critical discovery while researching Thomas Donovan's background, information that would further strengthen their case, but also escalate the conflict with Thornton to an entirely new level. The next morning brought unexpected activity to the Donovan farm. A van emblazoned with the National Historical Society logo arrived first, followed by 2 vehicles with federal government plates. Marcus Williams emerged from the lead car, accompanied by a distinguished woman in professional attire who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Donovan," Marcus called as Ray approached, "this is Dr. Vanessa Harris from the Department of Interior's Historical Preservation Division. After reviewing my preliminary filing, she flew in overnight from Washington." Ray shook hands with the federal official who studied him with keen interest. "Thomas Donovan was your great-great-grandfather, correct? His name appears in several federal archives that we've only recently cross-referenced. It seems he was much more than a simple farmer." "I'm just learning that myself," Ray admitted. "Until yesterday, he was just the ancestor who started our farm." Dr. Harris nodded. "Many Underground Railroad conductors kept their activities secret even from their families. The political climate of the post-Civil War era made public acknowledgement dangerous, particularly in border regions where sympathies remained divided." A second federal vehicle disgorged 2 more officials who were introduced as representatives from the African American Heritage Commission. Their presence underscored the seriousness with which the federal government was treating the discovery. As the group walked toward the farmhouse, Ray noticed a county sheriff's vehicle parked at his property entrance. Deputy Rodriguez approached, looking uncomfortable with his assignment. "Mr. Donovan, I've been instructed to deliver this," he said, handing him an envelope bearing the county seal. "It's a formal notice of code violations requiring immediate inspection access to your property. I'm required to inform you that refusal could result in fines or an order to vacate." The timing was deliberate. The county had clearly accelerated their bureaucratic pressure tactics at Thornton's request. Marcus took immediate notice of the exchange. "The emergency historical protection filing was registered last night," he assured Ray. It supersedes local code enforcement for non-safety issues. Dr. Harris stepped forward. Deputy, please inform your superiors that this property is now under Federal Historical Preservation Review. I've already notified your sheriff of our jurisdiction in this matter. The deputy looked relieved to have the decision taken out of his hands. I'll pass that along, ma'am. The assembled experts proceeded to the farmhouse basement, where Ray revealed the hidden room. The federal officials entered with reverent care, their initial professional reserve giving way to evident excitement as they examined the pristine historical evidence. This is extraordinary, Dr. Harris breathed, carefully examining the map on the wall without touching it. This appears to be a complete operational map of an underground railroad network that operated separately from previously. Documented routes, an invaluable historical record. The Heritage Commission officials focused on the ledger and personal artifacts. These entries align with our oral history records of movement patterns during this period, one observed. But this location was unknown to us. It appears to have operated with exceptional secrecy, even by Underground Railroad standards. For the next 2 hours, the experts meticulously documented the room's contents, taking photographs and creating detailed inventory lists without disturbing the fragile artifacts. They used specialized equipment to verify the age of the documents and construction materials. There's no question about the historical significance, Marcus declared as they concluded their initial survey. This site represents a unique and irreplaceable piece of American history. Dr. Harris nodded in agreement. Based on what we've documented today, I'll be recommending immediate federal protection under the National Historic Preservation Act. My preliminary assessment is that this site contains sufficient historical significance to qualify for priority landmark status. As the experts continued their work, Ellie arrived carrying a leather portfolio clutched tightly under her arm. I found something critical, she reported quietly to Ray. Remember how I mentioned researching your great-great-grandfather's background? Look at this. She opened the portfolio to reveal fragile newspaper clippings from 1865. The headline read, "Local Hero Returns from War, Purchases Farm," with a subheadline, "Thomas Donovan, Decorated Union Soldier, Establishes New Life in Silver Creek." Thomas Donovan wasn't just any Union soldier, Ellie explained. He served in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official African-American units in the U.S. Armed Forces. Your great-great-grandfather was black, Ray. Ray stared at the article in shock. That's impossible. My family has likely been passing as white for generations, Ellie finished gently. It wasn't uncommon after the Civil War, particularly for light-skinned black veterans who moved to new areas. The article mentions his light complexion, but clearly identifies him as a soldier in a black regiment. There's more, she continued, showing him another document, a faded military commendation. Thomas Donovan received a commendation for bravery at the Battle of Fort Wagner. After the war, he used his military pay to purchase this land, specifically because of its strategic location near the lake, perfect for helping others escape north. Ray sat heavily on a kitchen chair, processing this revelation about his ancestry. No one in my family ever mentioned this. Not my father, not my grandfather. They may not have known, Dr. Harris said, having overheard the conversation. Many families lost parts of their history, either deliberately through concealment or gradually through generations of silence. Marcus studied the newspaper clipping. This strengthens the historical significance exponentially. A black Union veteran establishing an underground railroad station after the Civil War represents an important and under-documented aspect of American history. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple heavy engines, and the distinctive beep of construction equipment backing up. Through the kitchen window, they could see a procession arriving. Construction vehicles, Thornton's luxury SUV and 2 county sheriff vehicles. "They're early," Ray said, checking his watch. "Thornton's deadline isn't until tomorrow." "He's hoping to establish presence before the protection is fully implemented," Marcus surmised. Classic developer tactic. Dr. Harris made a quick phone call, speaking in terse official language about federal jurisdiction and protected historical sites. As she concluded her call, she turned to Ray. "The U.S. Attorney is sending a representative immediately. Your property now has official federal protection status, pending formal review." As the Thornton contingent approached the farmhouse, Maxwell Thornton led the way, flanked by construction foremen holding rolled blueprints and what appeared to be permits. His confident stride faltered momentarily when he noticed the federal vehicles parked near the house. "Mr. Donovan," he called with forced authority, "we have county permits authorizing preliminary site preparation work. Our team will need complete access to begin environmental assessment for the lake development." Ray stepped forward, meeting him in the yard. "Mr. Thornton, as you can see, we have federal officials conducting an investigation of significant historical artifacts discovered on this property." Thornton's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the assembled officials. "County records show no historical designations for this property. Whatever amateur historical interest you've drummed up doesn't supersede legally issued permits based on proper zoning regulations." "This isn't amateur interest." Marcus stepped forward, introducing himself. "As representative of the State Historical Preservation Office, I'm formally notifying you that this property contains protected historical artifacts covered under both state and federal law." Thornton's expression tightened. "I find the timing of this supposed discovery extremely convenient, appearing just as we exercise our legal right to develop this area. This has all the hallmarks of a delaying tactic, which the county has already considered and rejected in issuing our permits. The timing is irrelevant to the legal standing of the historical significance," Dr. Harris said, stepping forward and presenting her federal credentials. "Dr. Vanessa Harris, Department of Interior. My office has granted preliminary protected status to this site pending full evaluation." For perhaps the first time in his professional career, Maxwell Thornton found himself genuinely off balance. The federal involvement elevated the situation beyond his network of local influence. "I have investors and contractors committed to this project," Thornton insisted, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "Millions have already been invested. Historical interests don't automatically invalidate properly issued permits and development rights." At that moment, a new vehicle arrived. A black SUV with U.S. Department of Justice markings. A man in a crisp suit emerged, carrying a leather briefcase embossed with the federal seal. "James Richardson, Assistant U.S. Attorney," he introduced, himself approaching the group. "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence submitted by Dr. Harris. The Department of Justice is issuing an immediate cease and desist on any activities that might impact the historical site, pending full federal review." He handed Ray an official document. "This federal preservation order supersedes local permits related to development access. The property is now under temporary federal protection." The convergence of state and federal authorities had created a legal barrier that completely upended Thornton's carefully orchestrated pressure campaign. Thornton looked from one official to another, searching for any remaining leverage and finding none. "This doesn't end the matter," Thornton said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Temporary orders eventually expire. The economic reality remains. This area needs development, and preventing progress based on questionable historical claims will not withstand legal and economic scrutiny." "I don't think you understand what we've discovered," Ellie said, stepping forward with the newspaper clipping. "This isn't just about historical artifacts. It's about a significant chapter in American history that deserves to be preserved. She ended the article to Richardson, who scanned it with professional interest. This suggests a direct connection between this property and post-Civil War Underground Railroad operations run by a black Union veteran, the federal attorney observed. That elevates the historical significance considerably and strengthens the case for permanent protection. Thornton's carefully maintained professional facade cracked visibly. These are historical curiosities that have no bearing on modern development needs. The economic benefits to this county far outweigh the preservation of some old hidden room. History isn't a curiosity, Mr. Thornton, Dr. Harris replied coolly, and the law is clear on the protection of significant historical sites, regardless of potential development value. As the confrontation unfolded in his farmyard, Ray felt a strange sense of connection to his great-great-grandfather. Thomas Donovan had carefully constructed this farmhouse not just as a residence, but as a purpose-built sanctuary to help people find freedom. Now, generations later, that same history was protecting the land from those who would exploit it without regard for its deeper significance. The construction crew began returning to their vehicles, clearly recognizing that the day's work would not proceed as planned. The county deputies, unwilling to challenge federal authority, returned to their vehicles after confirming the authenticity of the federal order. Thornton remained, his expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. "This is a temporary setback," he said to Ray, his voice low and intense. "My legal team will contest this designation. When the initial excitement fades, the economic argument will prevail, as it always does." "I don't think so," Ray replied calmly. "My ancestor risked everything to help people find freedom when others wanted to deny it to them. He preserved the truth, knowing it would be needed someday. This isn't just about economics. It's about honoring a legacy that was meant to last through generations." As Thornton departed, his usual confidence visibly shaken, Ellie and Marcus joined Ray, watching the procession leave the property. "The federal protection is just the beginning," Marcus explained. "With the evidence we've discovered, we can pursue permanent designation of this site under multiple preservation statutes. More importantly, we can share this history that's been hidden for so long." "What happens to the artifacts?" Ray asked. "That will be determined through consultation between federal officials and historical experts," Marcus replied. "But the protection guidelines would ensure your family's continued role as stewards of this site, a responsibility that would continue under any federal designation." As the afternoon progressed, additional historical experts arrived, along with preservation specialists from the Smithsonian Institution who had been urgently dispatched to assess the artifacts. The hidden room that had kept its secrets for generations was now the center of intense but respectful activity, with each item being carefully documented while remaining in place. Ray stood in his kitchen, watching the activity with a sense of wonder. The farm that had been a financial burden threatening to slip from his grasp was now recognized as a priceless historical treasure. The land that had sustained his family for generations would remain intact rather than becoming a playground for the wealthy, just as Thomas Donovan had intended when he established this sanctuary for freedom seekers more than 150 years ago. What Ray couldn't yet appreciate was how this discovery would not only save his farm, but transform his understanding of his own identity and place in American history, a transformation that would soon extend far beyond his property lines to touch lives throughout the community and beyond. 1 week after the dramatic confrontation at the farmhouse, Ray sat at his kitchen table, reviewing documents that would have seemed unimaginable just days earlier. The table was covered with official letters, preservation grants, and news articles about the Silver Creek Freedom Station, the name historians had given to the hidden room on his property. The federal protection order had been extended pending final determination of the site's historical status, effectively blocking Thornton's development plans indefinitely. The county commissioners, sensing the shifting political winds, had unanimously voted to rescind the special permits they had rushed through at Thornton's request. "I never expected this kind of attention," Ray told Ellie, as she arrived with more newspapers featuring stories about the discovery. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing with interview requests and historians wanting to visit." "You've uncovered a missing piece of American history," Ellie replied, setting down her bag. "It's not just the physical artifacts, it's the documentation. That ledger provides names and dates that connect to families who've been searching for their ancestors' paths to freedom for generations." The personal impact of the discovery had been equally profound for Ray. Learning about his African-American heritage had initially been shocking, but as he studied the documents and learned more about Thomas Donovan's courage both during and after the Civil War, shock had given way to pride. "I've been thinking about why my family never passed down this history," Ray said, pouring coffee for both of them. "Do you think they were ashamed?" Ellie considered the question carefully. "Not ashamed, protective. After Reconstruction ended, being identified as black in America came with serious dangers and disadvantages. Your ancestors probably started passing as white for safety, and eventually the knowledge was lost to subsequent generations. Thomas never hid who he was, though," Ray noted. "These newspaper articles clearly identify him as a soldier in a black regiment. Times were briefly different right after the Union victory," Ellie explained. "There was a window when black veterans were celebrated, especially in areas that had supported the Union. But that changed quickly as Reconstruction faltered. My guess is that as attitudes shifted, your family adapted to protect themselves while still quietly continuing Thomas's work." Ray's phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. area code. With some trepidation, he answered. "Mr. Donovan, this is Secretary Williams from the Department of Interior. I'm calling regarding the historical site on your property." Ray nearly dropped the phone. A cabinet secretary was calling his farmhouse. "Yes, ma'am," he managed to reply. "I've reviewed the preliminary assessment from our team, and I wanted to personally inform you that we're fast-tracking the designation process for national landmark status. The President has taken a personal interest in this discovery." After completing the call, Ray relayed the conversation to Ellie, who was equally astonished by the high-level attention. "This goes beyond regular historical preservation," she explained. "The combination of a black Union veteran establishing an underground railroad station after the Civil War, with intact documentation and artifacts, makes this nationally significant." Later that morning, Dr. Harris returned with news about preservation. "Funding. The National Trust has approved emergency grants for proper conservation of the site," she explained as they walked the property. "This will allow us to create appropriate environmental controls for the hidden room and its contents without damaging the historical integrity of your home." "What about the farm itself?" Ray asked. "I still have the mortgage problem." "That's part of the comprehensive preservation plan," Dr. Harris replied. "As a historically significant site, your property qualifies for several heritage programs that can help restructure your debt while maintaining the agricultural character of the land." She gestured toward the fields surrounding the farmhouse. "These grants wouldn't just preserve the hidden room, they would protect the entire farm, as it represents the complete historical context." Thomas Donovan didn't just build a safe room. He established a working farm that provided both cover for his Underground Railroad activities and sustainable support for those he helped. As they concluded their walk near the ancient oak tree, Ray noticed a sleek black car turning into his driveway. His stomach tightened when he recognized Maxwell Thornton in the passenger seat. this time without an entourage of construction crews or security personnel. "Mr. Thornton," Ray acknowledged as the billionaire approached alone. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." Thornton's demeanor was notably different, the aggressive confidence replaced by something more subdued. "I won't take much of your time," Thornton said. "My lawyers have advised me that the historical designation is likely to be approved, making any legal challenge impractical." Ray nodded, but waited silently. "I've come to offer an alternative proposition," Thornton continued. "One that might serve both our interests." Ray invited him to sit at a weathered picnic table near the oak tree, deliberately choosing neutral ground rather than inviting him into the house. "My son hasn't stopped talking about you," Thornton said unexpectedly. "Not just the rescue, but what he's learned about your great-great-grandfather since the discovery became public. He's become quite interested in Civil War history as a result." This was not the conversation Ray had anticipated. "I'm glad he's found something that interests him." "Ethan has struggled to find purpose," Thornton admitted. "When he almost drowned, it changed my perspective. The development project seemed less important after nearly losing him." Thornton straightened his shoulders, clearly uncomfortable with personal revelations. "To my point, instead of fighting the historical designation, I'd like to propose a partnership. My foundation could fund a proper historical center on a portion of your property, one that preserves both the Underground Railroad station and the agricultural heritage." Ray studied the billionaire with surprise. "You want to build a museum here?" "An educational center," Thornton clarified, "showcasing not just the hidden room, but the entire operation, how a working farm served as both cover and support for freedom seekers. We would provide funding for proper facilities while ensuring the farm itself remains operational." "Why would you do this?" Ray asked directly. Thornton was silent for a moment. "Partly practical reasons, redirecting the investment I've already made in this area, but also because—" He hesitated. "Because Ethan needs to see that there are consequences to actions, that some things can't be bought, and the other properties you purchased around the lake. I still plan to develop those, but on a smaller scale, vacation homes rather than a resort complex. The historical center would actually complement that approach, providing cultural context that many visitors would appreciate." Ray considered the proposal. It was unexpected, but potentially beneficial, preserving both the historical discovery and the working farm while providing financial stability. "I'd need guarantees that the farm remains operational," Ray said finally, "and assurances that the historical narrative would be presented accurately, not sanitized." "Of course," Thornton agreed. "The foundation would provide funding, but content and operational decisions would remain with a board of historical experts and your family representatives. My name might be on the building, but the story inside would be Thomas Donovan's, told as it deserves to be." As Thornton departed, promising to have formal proposals delivered the following week, Ray found himself in the improbable position of considering a partnership with the man who had recently threatened his livelihood. "What do you think?" he asked. Dr. Harris, who had discreetly withdrawn during the conversation but remained within earshot. "It's not unprecedented," she replied thoughtfully. "Private funding often supports public historical preservation. The key would be ensuring proper oversight and historical integrity. Could it work? With the right legal structures and guarantees, yes," she confirmed, "and it would solve the long-term funding challenges that many historical sites face. The federal designation would provide protection, while private funding could create a more comprehensive educational experience than government grants alone could support." 3 months later, Ray stood before a podium set up near the ancient oak tree, addressing an audience that would have been unimaginable in his previous life. State officials, historians, descendants of freedom seekers who had passed through the farm, and local residents had gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony of the Thomas Donovan Freedom and Heritage Center. My great-great-grandfather built this farm not just as a place to grow crops, but as a beacon of freedom during troubled times, Ray said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. For generations, my family maintained this land without fully understanding its true significance. Now that we know, we have a responsibility to share this history with the world. Seated in the front row was Maxwell Thornton, accompanied by his son, Ethan. The teenager had become a regular visitor to the farm, eager to learn about its history and even helping with chores during his visits. What had begun as a near tragedy when Ethan almost drowned had evolved into an unexpected mentorship, with Ray teaching the city-raised boy about farming and rural life. Also present were several families who had discovered through the ledgers records that their ancestors had passed through the Silver Creek Freedom Station. Their emotional connection to the site had added profound personal dimensions to what might otherwise have been merely academic historical interest. This center will tell not just the story of one man's courage, but of a network of people dedicated to freedom when that concept was still contested in America, Ray continued. It will preserve both the hidden room and the working farm that made its operation possible. Visitors will experience history not as something distant, but as something lived and worked through by real people making difficult choices. As Ray concluded his remarks and ceremonially broke ground for the new educational center, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed his struggling farm into a nationally recognized historical site. A chance rescue, a hidden room, and the unexpected revelation of his own heritage had converged to create something none of the participants could have anticipated. The farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure would now remain in agricultural use, while also serving as an educational resource. The mortgage that had threatened to end 5 generations of family stewardship had been restructured through a combination of preservation grants and foundation support. Most significantly, the hidden legacy of Thomas Donovan, Union soldier, Underground Railroad conductor, and freedom fighter, would finally be acknowledged and honored after more than 150 years of obscurity. The secret that one generation had kept out of necessity and subsequent generations had maintained out of tradition had finally served its ultimate purpose, preserving not just the land, but the principles upon which it had been established. The ceremony concluded, Ray watched Ethan Thornton carefully handling artifacts that would become part of the center's displays. The teenager who had nearly drowned in Silver Lake was now passionately invested in preserving the history he had inadvertently helped uncover. "He's different from when I first met him," Maxwell Thornton observed, joining Ray. "More focused, less entitled. Your influence, I suspect. Near-death experiences change people," Ray replied. "So does discovering purpose." Thornton nodded thoughtfully. "When I offered you that $1 million, I thought I was being generous. I didn't understand what true value was. And now I see that some legacies can't be bought," Thornton admitted. "They can only be honored." As dusk settled over the farm, the ancient oak tree that had guided freedom seekers with its carved symbols stood silhouetted against the fading light, a living witness to history that had finally been revealed. The land that had sustained generations of Donovans would continue to do so, but with a deeper purpose that honored its true legacy of courage, compassion, and commitment to human freedom. What had begun with a farmer saving a billionaire's son from drowning had culminated in the son and father helping to save a precious piece of American history. A transformation neither could have imagined when a helicopter first landed in a cornfield on a summer morning that now seemed a lifetime ago. 1 year to the day after Ray Donovan dove into Silver Lake to save a drowning teenager, the Thomas Donovan Freedom and Heritage Center opened its doors to the public. What had once been a modest family farm struggling to survive had been transformed into a nationally recognized historical site that blended living history with active agriculture. The morning sun cast long shadows across the property as Ray walked the grounds before the official opening ceremony. The farmhouse stood largely unchanged from the outside, maintaining its historical appearance while state-of-the-art preservation systems had been discreetly installed within. A new building, constructed to complement the original architecture, housed exhibits, research facilities, and educational spaces. Most importantly to Ray, the fields around the buildings remained in active cultivation. Visitors would experience not just museum exhibits, but a working farm that continued the agricultural traditions that had provided both cover and sustenance for the Underground Railroad station. "Hard to believe how much has changed in a year," Ellie remarked, joining him on his walk. Now, serving as the center's historical director, she had overseen the development of exhibits that told the story of the Freedom Station with historical accuracy and emotional impact. "Sometimes I still expect to wake up and find it was all a dream," Ray admitted, "that I'm still just a farmer about to lose his land to the bank. Instead, you're a farmer who happens to be the descendant of a Civil War hero and freedom fighter, operating a national historic site that also produces award-winning heirloom crops," Ellie summarized with a smile. "Life takes unexpected turns." The most profound change had been in Ray's understanding of his own identity and heritage. The discovery that his great-great-grandfather had been a black Union soldier who continued fighting for freedom after the war had initially been shocking, but shock had given way to pride and a deeper sense of purpose. Genetic testing had confirmed his African-American ancestry, and research had uncovered distant cousins who had maintained awareness of their black heritage, while Ray's branch of the family had either deliberately or gradually lost that knowledge. The family reunion, organized 6 months earlier, had brought together relatives who had lived separate lives, unaware of their connection to each other and to the Silver Creek Freedom Station. As visitors began arriving for the opening ceremony, Ray noticed a familiar black SUV pull into the designated VIP parking area. Maxwell and Ethan Thornton emerged, the teenager now sporting a volunteer T-shirt with the Heritage Center logo. As part of his personal transformation following his near-drowning experience, Ethan had become deeply involved in the center's development, particularly the youth education programs. "Mr. Donovan," Maxwell greeted him with the formal respect that had replaced their earlier antagonism. "Congratulations on the opening. The final result exceeds expectations." "Your foundation's support made it possible," Ray acknowledged. The Thornton Historical Preservation Foundation had provided substantial funding for the center, though control remained firmly with the historical board and Ray's family. "A worthy investment," Thornton replied. "The advanced ticket sales and research grant applications suggest it will be financially sustainable long-term." What had begun as a tense confrontation between a billionaire developer and a struggling farmer had evolved into an unlikely partnership. Thornton had redirected his development plans, creating more modest vacation properties around the lake that complemented rather than overwhelmed the rural character of the area. The Heritage Center had become the centerpiece that actually enhanced the value of his other investments, creating a destination that attracted both tourists and researchers. More significantly, the national attention garnered by the discovery had led to the identification of similar hidden stations across the region. 3 other properties had subsequently been found to contain concealed rooms or artifacts from the Underground Railroad, suggesting a coordinated network that had operated with extraordinary secrecy during and after the Civil War. "Governors, motorcade just arrived," Ethan reported, returning from his volunteer duties. The teenager had matured remarkably in the past year. His near-death experience and subsequent involvement with the Heritage Center having tempered his former privileged indifference. The opening ceremony began at noon under a clear blue sky. Dignitaries, including the governor, a representative from the Department of Interior, and descendants of freedom seekers who had passed through the Silver Creek station, gathered near the ancient oak tree that had once guided people to safety. With its carved symbols, this site represents not just the physical artifacts of history, but the enduring spirit of courage and commitment to freedom that defines the best of American ideals, the governor declared in her keynote address. What Thomas Donovan created here, and what his descendant Ray Donovan has preserved, reminds us that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts of moral courage when circumstances demand it. Ray listened from his seat on the stage, still, sometimes struggling to reconcile the modest family farm he had known all his life with its true historical significance. The hidden room that had preserved its secrets for over 150 years now stood as the centerpiece of a national historical landmark, its artifacts professionally preserved while remaining in their original context. After the formal speeches, Ray conducted the first official tour for the assembled dignitaries. The route began at the ancient oak tree, with its navigation markers, proceeded to the farmhouse where the hidden mechanism to the secret room was demonstrated, and concluded in the new exhibition hall, where historical context and personal stories were presented. What makes this site unique is that it remained operational after the Civil War ended, Ray explained, as they viewed the ledger in its climate-controlled display. Thomas Donovan continued helping people seek freedom even after slavery was legally abolished, recognizing that legal freedom didn't immediately translate to safety or opportunity. The most powerful exhibit featured the personal items found in the wooden chest, the carved bird, child's doll, and tarnished locket, alongside research that had identified some of their owners through the ledger entries. Video stations featured interviews with descendants who had discovered their ancestors' passage through the Silver Creek station, creating emotional connections to what might otherwise have remained abstract history. My great-great-grandmother left that doll behind when she passed through here in 1868, an elderly woman explained in one recorded interview. Family stories said she left it as a Thanksgiving offering for safe passage, but until now, we never knew where that happened or who had helped her. As the official opening concluded and the public began exploring the center, Ray found a quiet moment to visit the hidden room alone. Now professionally preserved but maintained in its original state, the small chamber retained the solemn atmosphere of its purpose. Standing in the space where so many had found temporary sanctuary on their journey to freedom, Ray felt the weight of the legacy he had inherited. "I never imagined this was what I was meant to protect," he said softly to the empty room. "But I think you meant for it to be found when it was needed most." Whether he was addressing Thomas Donovan or some larger sense of purpose, Ray couldn't have said. But the feeling of connection to his ancestor and to the people who had passed through this room gave meaning to the struggles that had preceded the discovery. That evening, after the last visitors had departed, a small private ceremony took place in the farmhouse kitchen. Ray, Ellie, Marcus, Dr. Harris, and the Thorntons gathered around the same table where a year earlier Maxwell Thornton had offered $1 million for saving his son. "I'd like to propose a toast," Thornton said, raising a glass. "To unexpected discoveries and second chances." The simple statement acknowledged the multiple layers of transformation that had occurred. A farm saved from financial ruin, a historical treasure preserved for future generations, a teenager's near tragedy, becoming a catalyst for growth, and a developer's plans redirected toward preservation rather than exploitation. "And to Thomas Donovan," Ray added, who built something that mattered enough to last. As twilight deepened outside, the group discussed future plans for the center, educational programs for local schools, research opportunities for historians, agricultural initiatives to preserve heritage crop varieties that Thomas Donovan had cultivated. What had begun as a desperate fight to save a family farm had evolved into a vibrant institution with purpose reaching far beyond property boundaries. Later, walking alone by Silver Lake in the gathering darkness, Ray reflected on the chain of events that had led to this transformation. A teenager's capsized kayak, a hidden room preserved for generations, an ancestor's secret legacy, random elements that had converged to create something none of the participants could have imagined. When the story began, the lake that had nearly claimed Ethan Thornton's life now reflected the stars overhead, its surface calm and untroubled. On the opposite shore, the tasteful vacation homes that had replaced Thornton's planned resort complex blended more harmoniously with the landscape, their lights seeming to complement rather than compete with the natural setting. The farm that had been in danger of slipping away from the Donovan family would now remain a working agricultural operation for generations to come, its historical significance ensuring protection that transcended economic pressures. More importantly, it would continue serving the purpose for which Thomas Donovan had established it, not just growing crops, but nurturing the ideals of freedom, courage, and human dignity that had guided his actions after the Civil War. As Ray turned back toward the farmhouse that had sheltered 5 generations of his family, he felt a deep sense of continuity and purpose. The ancient oak tree stood silhouetted against the night sky, its branches spread wide as if in protection of the land beneath it, just as it had when it guided freedom seekers to safety more than a century and a half ago. "We kept our promise," Ray said quietly to the night air. "The land is safe, the truth is known, the legacy continues." Whether anyone else could hear those words didn't matter. The wind rustling through the oak leaves seemed response enough, a whispered affirmation connecting past, present, and future across the generations of those who had called this place home and those who had found freedom within its boundaries. The story that had begun with a farmer diving into a lake to save a drowning teenager had culminated in the preservation of a precious piece of American history, a transformation that honored both personal courage and historical significance, proving that sometimes the most valuable treasures are those hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true purpose. 2 years after the Thomas Donovan Freedom and Heritage Center opened its doors, what had begun as a local historical discovery had created ripples that extended far beyond Silver Creek Valley. On a crisp autumn morning, Ray stood at the edge of his cornfield watching a yellow school bus navigate the winding road to the center's entrance. 4th school group this week, noted Jasmine Williams, the center's education director. A former high school history teacher, she had joined the staff 6 months after opening, drawn by the opportunity to connect students with tangible evidence of the past. "They're coming from further away now," Ray observed. "This one's from the city, nearly 3 hours by bus. Your story resonates with people," Jasmine replied. "Not just the historical aspects, but the personal journey. A farmer saving a billionaire's son, discovering his own heritage, preserving history instead of selling out to development. It's the kind of narrative that cuts through the noise of modern life." Ray still found the public attention somewhat uncomfortable, though he'd grown more accustomed to it over time. What had begun as local news had expanded into national coverage, including a documentary film about the discovery and its significance that had won awards at several film festivals. The educational impact had been particularly significant. Over 20,000 students had now visited the center, experiencing history through the tangible reality of the hidden room and working farm. For many, especially those from urban environments, it was their first connection to both agricultural life and the concrete reality of the Underground Railroad beyond textbook descriptions. The governor's office called again about the statewide curriculum initiative Jasmine mentioned as they walked toward the center to greet the arriving students. They want to expand the pilot program to all fifth-grade classrooms next year. The curriculum, developed in partnership with state educators, used the Silver Creek Freedom Station as a focal point for teaching about post-Civil War history, incorporating virtual tours of the site for schools unable to visit in person. What had begun as a local educational resource had evolved into a model for history education that emphasized personal connections to the past. As they reached the visitor center, Ray noticed a familiar face among the disembarking students. Ethan Thornton, now a freshman history major at the State University, was accompanying the school group as part of his internship program. "Mr. Donovan," Ethan greeted him with genuine warmth, "I've brought 30 very excited fifth graders who have been studying your great-great-grandfather all semester." The transformation in the once privileged teenager remained remarkable to Ray. Nearly drowning in Silver Lake had been the catalyst, but Ethan's subsequent involvement with the Heritage Center had provided direction for that initial wake-up call. Now pursuing a degree in history, with emphasis on civil rights, he had become an articulate advocate for historical preservation and education. "How's your father?" Ray asked as they walked together toward the exhibits. "Surprisingly content," Ethan replied. "The Silver Creek Resort properties have been more profitable than he expected, though on a smaller scale than his original vision. And the Foundation's work has given him a taste for philanthropy that seems to satisfy something his business success never did." Maxwell Thornton's evolution had been less dramatic than his son's, but no less significant. The Thornton Historical Preservation Foundation had expanded beyond its initial support of the Heritage Center to fund similar projects throughout the region, becoming a respected voice in the preservation community. More remarkably, the former developers who had once pressured small property owners to sell had become advocates for balanced development that respected historical and cultural significance. Several projects now explicitly incorporated historical preservation into their designs rather than viewing it as an obstacle to overcome. As Ray helped guide the school group through the center's main exhibits, he was struck by the students' engagement with the personal artifacts. Children who might have fidgeted through abstract historical discussions leaned forward with rapt attention as he explained the significance of the carved wooden bird left behind by a freedom seeker in 1869. He couldn't carry much with him as he traveled north, Ray explained, but he wanted to leave something to thank the people who had helped him. So he carved this bird during the 3 days he sheltered here, waiting for safe passage. "Did he make it to freedom?" a small girl with braided hair asked intently. "He did," Ray confirmed. "We know because he wrote a letter back to Thomas Donovan 2 years later from Canada. A copy of that letter is in the next exhibit." The personal connections to history had proven to be the center's most powerful educational tool. Abstract concepts became concrete when attached to individual stories, particularly when those stories could be traced through to present-day descendants. After the formal tour concluded, Ray led the students to the working farm section of the property, where heritage crop varieties similar to those grown by Thomas Donovan were still cultivated. Here, the children could experience the agricultural practices that had provided both cover and sustenance for the Underground Railroad operation. Thomas Donovan understood that freedom meant more than just escape from slavery, Ray explained, as the students examined heirloom corn varieties preserved from the 19th century. It meant self-sufficiency and the ability to sustain oneself. The crops grown here not only provided food for those passing through, but taught agricultural skills they could use as they established new lives. This holistic approach to history connecting the physical site, personal artifacts, documented stories, and ongoing agricultural practices, had made the Heritage Center a model studied by museums and historical sites throughout the country. Later, that afternoon, after the school group departed, Ray met with Dr. Vanessa Harris, who had returned for the center's regular federal review. Their walking tour of the property concluded at the ancient oak tree, its spreading branches now protected by special conservation measures to ensure its continued health. The integration of active agriculture with historical preservation remains the most innovative aspect of this site, Dr. Harris noted, making entries on her tablet. Most historical properties become frozen in time, but this one continues to evolve while honoring its past. Thomas would have wanted it that way, Ray replied. He didn't build a monument, he built a working farm that served a higher purpose. Keeping it productive honors that legacy better than turning it into a static museum. The concept had influenced preservation approaches beyond the Heritage Center itself. Several other historical farms across the country had adopted similar models, maintaining agricultural operations alongside historical preservation rather than seeing the two as mutually exclusive. Perhaps most significantly, the discovery of the Silver Creek Freedom Station had sparked renewed interest in documenting post-Civil War Underground Railroad activities, a period often overlooked in traditional historical accounts. Research inspired by the center's ledger had identified over a dozen previously unknown stations that had operated during Reconstruction, revealing a more extensive network than historians had previously recognized. Your panel presentation at next month's national conference is fully booked, Dr. Harris mentioned as they concluded their tour. The academic community remains intensely interested in how this discovery is reshaping our understanding of post-war resistance networks. Ray still found it somewhat surreal to be addressing academic conferences, though he'd grown more comfortable with his role as both farmer and historical steward. The dual identity mirrored that of his great-great-grandfather, who had balanced practical agricultural work with commitment to a larger cause. That evening, after the day's visitors had departed, Ray walked alone to Silver Lake, following the path that Ethan Thornton had taken on the day he nearly drowned. The water reflected the sunset in shimmering orange and gold, peaceful now that the day's activities had concluded. Across the lake, the vacation homes developed by Thornton Properties blended harmoniously with the landscape, their designs required to complement rather than dominate the natural setting. The compromise solution, preserving the Heritage Center while allowing modified development of adjacent properties, had proven more successful than either party had initially imagined. As Ray contemplated the transformed landscape, his phone chimed with a news alert. Opening it, he found himself looking at the headline, Silver Creek Freedom Station, designated national monument by presidential proclamation. The announcement had come sooner than expected, elevating the site's status from National Historic Landmark to National Monument, a designation that brought additional protections and resources while maintaining the family's stewardship role. The accompanying statement cited the site's exceptional importance in illuminating overlooked aspects of post-Civil War history and its innovative approach to integrating historical preservation with continuing agricultural tradition. Standing by the lake that had set these events in motion, Ray felt a profound sense of completion. The farm that had been nearly lost to foreclosure was now permanently protected, its significance recognized at the highest national level. The history that had been hidden for generations would now be preserved in perpetuity, accessible to all who sought to understand this chapter of America's past. What had begun with a desperate dive into Silver Lake to save a drowning teenager had culminated in the preservation of a precious piece of American history, a transformation that neither Ray Donovan nor Maxwell Thornton could have imagined when a helicopter landed in a cornfield on that fateful summer morning. As darkness settled over the valley, the lights of the Heritage Center glowed warmly against the twilight, a beacon of history and hope in the rural landscape. The ancient oak tree stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its branches spread wide, still guiding visitors to a place of discovery, just as it had once guided freedom seekers to sanctuary, the land where Ray's ancestors had cultivated. Both crops and courage would continue its dual purpose into the future, preserved not as a static monument, but as a living legacy that connected past and present in the ongoing story of freedom, resilience, and the unexpected ways ordinary people can change the course of history. "Well done, Thomas," Ray said quietly to the evening breeze. "Your work continues." 5 years after the dramatic helicopter landing that had changed everything, the Thomas Donovan Freedom and Heritage Center hosted a special anniversary celebration. The event coincided with the completion of a major expansion that included new research facilities, expanded educational space, and enhanced agricultural programs. As dawn broke over Silver Creek Valley, Ray stood at the edge of his fields watching the rising sun illuminate the landscape his family had tended for generations. The farm remained a working agricultural operation, though its focus had shifted toward heritage varieties and educational farming rather than commercial production. The fields surrounding the Heritage Center demonstrated 19th century farming techniques alongside modern, sustainable practices, creating a living timeline of agricultural history. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years, Ellie remarked, joining him on his morning walk. Now the center's director of research and archives, she had overseen the creation of one of the country's most comprehensive collections of Underground Railroad documentation. "Some days it feels like yesterday," Ray replied. "Other days it seems like another lifetime ago." The transformation had been both profound and far-reaching. What had begun as a local historical discovery had evolved into a nationally recognized center for research, education, and reconciliation. Over 100,000 visitors annually now experience the site where Thomas Donovan had created his hidden sanctuary for freedom seekers. As they walked toward the Heritage Center, evidence of the expansion project was visible in tastefully designed new buildings that complemented the original farmhouse. The architectural approach deliberately echoed the farmhouse's modest scale and materials while incorporating modern sustainability features. "The governors confirmed for the ceremony?" Ray asked as they surveyed the preparations. "Along with 2 senators, the Secretary of the Interior, and representatives from 16 historical societies," Ellie confirmed. "Plus the family reunification group, 74 confirmed descendants of people who passed through the Silver Creek station." This aspect had perhaps been the most meaningful outcome of the discovery. Painstaking research using the ledger entries had identified hundreds of individuals who had sought freedom through the Silver Creek station after the Civil War. Modern descendants of these freedom seekers had formed a community connected by this shared history, many discovering family connections they had never known existed. The annual family reunification gathering had become a centerpiece of the center's programming, bringing together people whose ancestors had shared this journey, but whose families had scattered across the continent in subsequent generations. As Ray entered the visitor center, now expanded to 3 times its original size, he greeted staff, members preparing for the day's events. What had begun with a handful of volunteers had grown to a professional team of 30, plus dozens of regular volunteers from the surrounding community and university. In the research wing, a group of graduate students worked with original documents and digital archives, continuing to expand understanding of post-Civil War Underground Railroad activities. The discovery at Silver Creek had sparked similar findings. Throughout the region, revealing a more extensive network than historians had previously recognized. Final preparations for the Thornton Research Library dedication are complete, reported Marcus Williams, now serving as the center's Director of Preservation. The time capsule is ready for the ceremony. The new research library represented Maxwell Thornton's most significant contribution to the center, funded through his foundation with an endowment ensuring its operation in perpetuity. The billionaire who had once threatened the farm's existence had become one of its most committed supporters, though his transformation had been gradual and not without occasional tensions. Ray made his way to the original farmhouse, still the emotional heart of the center despite the expansions around it. The hidden room remained exactly as they had discovered it 5 years earlier, though now protected by state-of-the-art preservation systems. Visitors still experienced the powerful moment of revelation as the concealed door swung open, revealing the sanctuary that had sheltered hundreds on their journey to freedom. As he checked final preparations, Ray noticed an elderly couple being guided through the exhibits by a familiar figure, Ethan Thornton, now completing his master's degree in historical preservation. The near-drowning victim, whose rescue had set these events in motion, had become an articulate advocate for the center's mission, frequently leading specialized tours for distinguished visitors. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson are direct descendants of William Jackson, who passed through here in 1871, Ethan explained, introducing them to Ray. They've donated his journal to our collection. It contains a detailed description of his time here at Silver Creek. The elderly man extended his hand with visible emotion. Our family has kept this journal for generations, but it belongs here where others can learn from it. We never knew exactly where the stone farmhouse with the hidden room was located until your discovery made the news. These connections continue to emerge, each one adding another thread to the tapestry of history being rewoven at Silver Creek. What had been hidden for generations was now being restored to public memory, one personal story at a time. By mid-morning, the Heritage Center grounds were filling with visitors for the anniversary celebration. The parking area, now expanded to accommodate tour buses and school groups, overflowed with vehicles from across the country. The event had attracted national media attention, with satellite trucks positioned near the ancient oak tree where the main ceremony would take place. As Ray moved through the crowds, greeting various dignitaries and supporters, he spotted Maxwell Thornton arriving with his family. The billionaire's approach to the center had evolved from reluctant compromise to genuine commitment as he witnessed its impact on his son and the broader community. Ray, Thornton greeted him with the informal warmth that had gradually replaced their earlier antagonism. The expansion exceeds expectations. Your foundation support made it possible, Ray acknowledged, shaking his hand. A worthy investment, Thornton replied, echoing words he had spoken years earlier, but now with deeper understanding behind them. Though I still remember when I thought this land would be better used for luxury vacation homes. And I remember when I thought my family farm was just about growing crops, Ray responded with a smile. The ceremony began at noon with the ancient oak tree, now protected by a carefully designed plaza that preserved its root system, providing shade for the assembled dignitaries. The governor spoke first, highlighting the center's educational impact across the state. The Secretary of the Interior followed, emphasizing its significance to national historical preservation efforts. When Ray's turn came to address the gathering, he focused not on the buildings or programs, but on the human connections that gave them meaning. 5 years ago, a chain of events began that none of us could have anticipated, he said, looking out over the assembled crowd. What started with a desperate rescue in Silver Lake led to the discovery of history that had been hidden for generations. But the true significance wasn't in the hidden room or artifacts. It was in the stories of courage, determination, and hope that they represented. He gestured toward the section where descendants of freedom seekers were seated together. Thomas Donovan created this sanctuary to help people find freedom when that journey remained dangerous even after slavery had been legally abolished. Today, we continue that legacy by connecting their descendants with their history and with each other, healing separations that have persisted for generations. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of the Thornton Research Library and the sealing of a time capsule containing artifacts and documentation from the center's first 5 years, designed to be opened in 50 years. It symbolized the ongoing commitment to preserving history for future generations. As the formal events transitioned to a community celebration with music, food, and educational activities spread across the grounds, Ray found a quiet moment to visit the hidden room alone. Though he had seen it countless times over the past 5 years, its impact never diminished. Standing in the space where so many had found temporary sanctuary on their journey to freedom, he felt the weight and privilege of the legacy he had inherited. Later that afternoon, as the celebration continued on the grounds, Ray walked with Ethan down to Silver Lake. The water sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, peaceful and inviting, so different from the day when Ethan had struggled against drowning. It's strange to think how differently things might have turned out, Ethan remarked as they stood on the shore. If you hadn't been fixing fences that day, if I had known how to swim properly, or if I'd accepted your father's offer and sold the farm, Ray added. Sometimes I think about parallel universes. Where those things happened, Ethan admitted. Where this is all a luxury resort and the hidden room was destroyed during construction, never discovered. But that's not what happened, Ray reminded him. In this universe, a teenager nearly drowned. A farmer dove in to save him. And history, that had been hidden for generations, was finally revealed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, the celebration reached its final event, a candlelight procession from the ancient oak tree to the farmhouse, retracing the path that freedom seekers would have followed to reach sanctuary. Hundreds of participants, many of them descendants of those who had passed through Silver Creek, carried candles along the path, marked by subtle lighting, designed to evoke 19th-century lanterns. Ray watched from the farmhouse porch. As the procession approached, the line of lights stretching back to the oak tree like a living connection between past and present. In the gathering dusk, it was easy to imagine Thomas Donovan standing in this same spot, watching for those seeking refuge and freedom. As darkness settled over the valley, the Heritage Center's lights illuminated the historic buildings and new additions that together told the story of Silver Creek. The ancient oak tree was gently lit, its spreading branches creating a canopy of shadows and light that seemed to embrace the gathering below. The land that had sustained generations of Donovans would continue its dual purpose into the future, preserved not as a static monument but as a living legacy. The farm, where Ray's ancestors had cultivated both crops and courage, would remain productive soil, growing food, knowledge, understanding, and healing for generations to come. What had begun with a farmer diving into a lake to save a drowning teenager had culminated in the preservation and amplification of a precious piece of American history, a transformation neither could have imagined on that summer morning that now seemed a lifetime ago. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Ray remained on the farmhouse porch, watching as the lights of departing vehicles wound their way along the rural roads leading from Silver Creek Valley. The Heritage Center stood illuminated against the night sky, a beacon of history and hope in the landscape. 5 years of unexpected journey had brought him full circle, still a farmer tending his land, but now with a deeper understanding of why that land had been worth preserving across generations. The heritage he safeguarded wasn't just about buildings or artifacts, but about the enduring human pursuit of freedom and dignity, and the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things in service to that cause. The ancient oak tree stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, its branches spread wide, still marking the path to sanctuary, just as it had for generations. And in the quiet rustling of its leaves, Ray could almost hear the whispered affirmation of ancestors whose courage and commitment had made this moment possible, whose legacy would now endure, revealed and honored at last. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't those found in history books, but those hidden in plain sight, in family farms, ancient trees, and ordinary people who make extraordinary choices when circumstances demand. And sometimes saving a life leads to saving history itself, creating ripples that extend far beyond what anyone could have imagined when a helicopter landed in a cornfield on a summer morning 5 years ago. If you've been moved by this story of unexpected connections across time and circumstance, remember that history surrounds us, waiting to be discovered, acknowledged, and honored. The past isn't as distant as we sometimes think, and the actions of ordinary people can change the course of history in ways that may only be revealed generations later. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.